I'd like to hear all the data, but then recap and simplify it. Like I also said before, I go into this completely objective, so I'm going to believe what the reason, whatever you guys tell me. So like I said, they tell me some outlandish thing, the sky is red, you guys tell me something else, or I'm going to go with them and say it's red. I should also throw, I don't really flow cross-examinations. I do flow everything else though, so if you get something that you want to use in the cross-ex, make sure you use that once you go back up there and start talking, then that's how it's going to get on the flow in our way, either for or against you. But other than that, I think that's about it. Congratulations for making it this far.
So pretty much the same flow, everything. I'm talking about speed, in your rebuttals and summary signposts, or else it's not going to get on the boat. I don't know where to put it. Tell me why I should vote for these things. Give me warrants for everything, because if you just say something's going to happen but don't tell me how or why, like, what am I to vote off of?
I'm a flow judge, but a flow judge in the sort of like weird PF sense of the word, where it's like you sort of flow and then you're just sort of writing voters. So I want to hear like why things are important, and specifically, I really like definitions. And the big thing in this debate, tell me what U.S. interests are. But like I've had a lot of rounds earlier where people have said like, oh, we're going to destabilize Ukraine. Why do I care that Ukraine is destabilized? Normally, when I'm judging, I'll sort of like put on reality glasses and sort of be like, you need to like convince me that this argument is like real and not based in weird debate fantasy. But just for the sake of consistency with the other judges, I can judge this as like a tabula rasa thing. So if you tell me the sky is purple, then sure. But also like if your opponents say like that's ridiculous, but you know you're taking a risk there with basing things not in reality. So yeah, link everything back to U.S. interests and tell me really explicitly what those things are and like why I should care. Because if I'm coming into this with like no like preconceived notions about what's important, then like I don't care that people are dying in Syria unless you tell me why that matters. Know your evidence, be able to do like evidence calls, put dates on everything because the world changes quickly, especially with like more newsy topics like this. So if you have two different numbers for people in Ukraine, I want to hear when those numbers are from.
Post-dating super important.
Yeah. Also, don't do roadmaps unless you have something interesting with you. Like if you tell me that your roadmap is that your rebuttal is their case and then your case, that's a waste of everyone's time. Is that all that I usually say there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have fun. Be polite.
Yeah, don't be douches during prospects.
Yeah.
It's
Like,
really turn off. Like, I don't vote off that, but like
don't make me
don't
hate
do
you.
that.
Yeah, I think that's all.
Yeah.
What is everyone? Okay. Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Okay. We affirm resolve. On balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia preventing conflict against Western countries because lives outweigh all other impacts. Contention 1, oil. The Financial Times reports that Western sanctions are uniquely devastating to Russia's energy industry. Sanctions have frozen the funds of Russian oil companies, restricted foreign investment in Russian energy projects, and prohibited Western companies from supplying technologies that are necessary for Russian oil drilling and production. According to the Oxford Energy Institute, without Western technology and operational expertise, Russian oil production will decline over 10% every year for the foreseeable future as currently utilized oil fields dry up. Sanctions will also prevent Russia from accessing new sources of oil. Russia recently started preparations to drill the Arctic, to offset the eventual offset of its current oil fields. According to the Wilson Center, Russia must develop these Arctic oil fields by 2020 or will not be able to maintain production levels necessary to balance the budget. However, the Russian energy industry reports that sanctions have delayed drilling the Arctic until at least 2025, a full 5 years later than Russia can manage. By reducing Russian oil production in both the short and long term, sanctions reduce Russian aggression. A study by Professor of Political Science Jeff Colgan finds that states which experience a large decline in oil income are 250% less likely to engage in conflict or aggressive behavior. Additionally, the Wall Street Journal reports that deterring Russian expansion in the Arctic is key to avoiding global competition over Arctic resources, which the Russian government insists could result in full-scale war between the U.S. and Russia. Contention 2, Baltic invasion. According to U.S. Navy Captain Rob Newson, Russia is currently engaged in hybrid warfare against the West in Ukraine. Hybrid warfare is defined as a combination of conventional and unconventional forces, including intelligence efforts, cyber attacks, political proxies, and insurgencies. The Geneva Center for Security Policy reports that economic sanctions should always be the first step towards countering hybrid warfare, both for their ease of implementation and effectiveness at deterring aggression. According to Chatham House, the political signal alone that sanctions send is enough to deter Russian aggression, regardless of whether sanctions even have an economic impact. That's why the EU Institute for Security Studies reports that sanctions are already preventing military adventurism in Ukraine. Without sanctions, Russia would have seized larger chunks of territory, including the entirety of Novorossiya and the cities of Mariupol and Odessa. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace also reports that pro-Russian soldiers and weapons are being withdrawn from Ukraine right now because of sanctions. In addition, the Russian government recently offered to restructure Ukraine's debt to help stabilize Ukraine's economy. Clearly, sanctions are containing and deterring Russian hybrid warfare. But what is the cost of removing sanctions? Well, according to the Military Times, if NATO cannot contain Russian hybrid warfare in Ukraine, Putin will use similar tactics to take over the nearby Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Unlike Ukraine, these Baltic states are members of NATO, and Article 5 of NATO's treaty declares that an attack on one member is an attack on all. According to the Hoover Institute, Article 5 is, quote, the bedrock assumption on which NATO is founded and draws strength. So in response to a Russian invasion of the Baltics, NATO will have two options. One, stand down and fail to uphold Article 5, or two, defend the Baltics in a war against Russia. If NATO stands down, Article 5 will be proven worthless and NATO's credibility will be destroyed. The Center for Eastern European Studies concludes that refusing to military protect the Baltics would lead to the collapse of NATO itself. This would destroy deterrence of future Russian aggression and nuclear provocation, increasing the probability that Russia invades other Western states, according to security analyst Michael Rule. For these reasons, Professor of Political Science Josh Roedner concludes that NATO will choose option 2, and a Russian invasion of the Baltics would lead to a NATO military response. This NATO-Russian standoff would, quote, easily spiral into full-scale war between the West and Russia, according to the Center for Transatlantic Relations. As Russia becomes embroiled in an unwinnable conventional war against NATO, it will use nuclear strikes to equalize the battlefield, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. For these reasons, we strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
Can I see evidence?
Yeah.
One that oil declines 10% every year without Western technologies. And then on the Baltic invasion, any car, like the card that says that like Russia's going to invade the Baltic regions and NATO's going to retaliate back. So I guess 2 there.
Okay, so
Ready to vote.
military time. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to prep things.
So 11, 14. Okay, so it goes Oxford,
Yeah,
then
Oxford.
military times, then Oxford.
Yeah. Or whatever that says that the Baltic region.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, my jug is ready. Meeting gate, contention 1 retaliation. Sanctions drive Putin into a corner, forcing him to lash out to get rid of the sanctions. Fisher Vox reports that weakening the Russian economy will make Putin even more aggressive and less willing to compromise. This has been seen in 2 cases. First, Ukraine. Ashford of Cato finds that after economic sanctions, Kremlin's aggression grew with the formal annexation of Crimea. Sanctions forced Putin to escalate the Ukrainian crisis even further to try to force a better deal. Indeed, Nathan of Independent reports that Putin ordered 50,000 more troops into Ukraine this past summer. As a result, Miller RFE finds that the situation in eastern Ukraine is once again on the verge of open warfare. American journal Political Science concludes that sanctions increase the probability of conflicts by over 195%. Second, counter-sanctions. Russia extended its food import ban in retaliation for Western sanctions over the Ukraine crisis. Son of Wall Street Journal reports that Russia has embargoed several categories of food products from the Western nations. The most serious consequences of Russia's reverse sanctions have been felt in European agriculture. In fact, the Farmers Union estimates that the Russian embargo has caused the recent decline in global dairy prices to a 30-year low. Russia's ban on imports of EU dairy has led to a slump in demand and sharp drop in payments to EU farmers. In Sweden and Denmark, the current price is below the necessary price for dairy farmers to make a profit, and 86% of farmers face bankruptcy if the situation does not improve. Contention to the Middle East. Sanctions give Russia two main incentives to increase conflict in the Middle East. First, perception. Tamerko of The Guardian explains that the more Putin can entrench his military in the Middle East, the more influential he becomes on the global stage, allowing him to sidestep the harms of sanctions. In other words, sanctions give Putin a reason to show the world that he will not let them interfere with his strict foreign policy agenda. Second, according to Adamski of Foreign Affairs, sanctions crippled and inflation hit Moscow also sees economic opportunities in the Middle East in the years ahead. The impact is twofold. First, Iran. Foreign Policy Initiative reports that Putin has moved rapidly to strengthen a partnership between Russia and Iran to weaken U.S. influence. Sahida Middle East Eye reports that in response to sanctions, Putin has decided to sell S-300 air missiles to Iran as a result. Defense News reports that sales have begun as of November. This poses a massive threat to Western interests. The Iran nuclear deal stopped Iranian nuclear proliferation by enforcing the threat of airstrikes, which is only undermined by the sale of Russia S-300 missiles to Iran. Lapan of Gatestone Institute explains that Iran can use the S-300 system to harden air defenses around its multiple nuclear sites, making any potential future air attack significantly more difficult and presenting Iran's threshold nuclear status as an almost invulnerable established fact. In this case, the S-300 would not merely complicate any effort to prevent an Iranian nuclear breakout, but also embolden Tehran to project its power with relative impunity. Second, Russian power projection. Cafiero of Low Foreign Policy reports that deterioration of Russia's ties with the West has fomented tensions in the Middle East. Russia is undermining the U.S.'s remaining influence in the Middle East while enhancing its own footprint in the region. Middle Eastern states are turning to Russia for weapons and nuclear energy at a time when U.S.'s traditional Middle Eastern allies have grown disillusioned with U.S. foreign policy. Recent arms and energy deals between Russia and Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other states have substantially increased. Earlier this year, Putin traveled to Egypt and signed an arms deal worth $3.5 billion. Russia and Jordan signed a $10 billion deal in which Moscow agreed to build the country's first nuclear power plant. The Russian decision strengthens Middle Eastern countries' negotiation positions and puts additional pressure on Western states. For all these reasons, we strongly urge a negative vote. Thank you.
Can we see that 82% of farmers will go bankrupt by these sanctions? Yeah, and also the Nathan 50,000 troop card.
And then also, did you read through the cards or just?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, here.
Oh yeah.
So it was the Nathan card and then the 82% farmers will go bankrupt card.
Yep, just get it too.
Okay, cool. When was this one? Alright, you guys can do cross-ups.
Are all the judges good? Okay. Do you mind if I ask the first question?
Yeah.
Okay, so you talk about how Russia's doing nuclear deals with Egypt and Jordan, right?
Yeah.
Are those countries U.S. allies or Russian allies?
So the reason why they threaten Western interests is because it throws off the stability of the Middle East.
Well, but just, is Egypt and Jordan, are they pro-U.S. or pro-Russia?
Well, when they
They're
deal
specific
with it,
U.S. allies in the Middle East, correct? The U.S. does a lot of different joint operations with both countries. So why would improving their
Because-
own hegemony in the region
because
hurt
like
the
for
U.S.?
one, giving arms to some countries would instigate like an arms race in the Middle East that throws off stability in the Middle East,
Well,
and that's against Western interests.
okay, but how does it hurt Western interests if the countries that they're providing these weapons for are pro-West?
Because other countries in the Middle East respond to that.
Well,
Can
okay,
I have the
but,
next question?
yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about oil development.
Yeah.
Is the Arctic the only way for like Russia to expand upon its oil?
We tell you specifically with the Wilson card, the Arctic is the only viable way for Russia to be able to maintain its current production levels. That's the
Okay.
only option they have.
So how much percent of Russian oil would come from Arctic?
I mean, I can bring you an empiric if, I'm not sure we have one, but it basically just says that if they can't drill in the Arctic by 2020, they won't be able to maintain their current production levels, which means they can't balance the budget.
So the reason why they can't drill is because of lack of Western investment, as you say, right?
No, okay, there's a lot of different roots. One is lack of Western investment. Another one's lack of technology. Another one's lack of expertise to use that technology.
So why can't they just turn to another country to invest?
Because here's
They
the
can
key
use
thing.
that investment to develop more
Because
technology.
what I just said is why that doesn't happen. Is because, yeah, let's say they go to China. Maybe they'll get the funds. One, China doesn't have the technology Russia needs, and two, China can't provide the operational expertise that Russia needs to actually use that technology. So even if they can get the funds, they still can't drill in the Arctic. Do you mind if I ask a question now? Okay, so your card about 50,000 troops moving into Ukraine.
Mhm.
Are they in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, or are they in the pro-West Ukraine area?
I'm not sure exactly which areas they're in.
So they weren't actually moved over the front line into Ukraine.
They
These-
were moved into Ukraine, that's what I
Yeah,
heard.
but they were moved into the Ukraine part that is still occupied by Russia. It's not an increased advancement, it's simply increasing their reinforcements there. So how
No,
does,
it's actually increased aggression because it results in more deaths
Okay,
by
well,
civilians as a
okay, well,
result
but I
of
mean,
that.
okay, also on that card, the card itself says that they've only verified 9,000 troops there.
No, the first sentence of the card
Yeah.
says it has risen to 50,000.
Yeah, and it says they don't know about this. It says Ukraine has claimed 50,000 troops moved in. We don't know.
Right,
All
which
we
is
know
more
are
than you showed.
9,000 there.
I know,
I
but
mean-
it's more than you showed, and
Yeah,
it's
but,
a
I mean, it's
substantial
not
increase.
50,000.
Even if it's 9,000, that's still an inherent increase.
Well, no,
in
but the
troops.
9,000 troops was already there. That's the key
Okay,
difference.
can I have the next question?
Yeah.
So you talk about this Baltic invasion, how probable is it that Russia will
100%.
invade?
We tell you
100%.
that if Russia wasn't prevented from using hybrid war in Ukraine, they would use the same tactic because they see, oh, it's working in Ukraine. We're going to go use it on these nearby Baltic states because that is in their interest to recreate the Soviet Union. That's the impact of that. We tell you that since sanctions prevent Russian hybrid warfare from being effective in Ukraine, Russia can't use the same tactic.
Alright, just a quick question about this card. What year was it published? All I see is Friday, September 4th. Is there a year for this? Yeah, like on weeks. Okay, yeah. Okay, so we'll just. Okay, alright, yeah, so, we'll take some prep right now. Okay, stop rep, 15 seconds. Judges ready? Runners ready?
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's start off with framework. Extend our definition of Western interest, which is to prioritize and protect the lives of citizens in Western countries. So lives outweigh all other impacts in this round, since life is a prerequisite to enjoying anything else. Next, look to reducing. The definition of reducing is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as to, quote, make smaller in amount or degree. Thus, the AF's burden is not to completely eliminate the threat Russia poses. As long as the AF shows that a world without sanctions, Russia poses a greater threat to the West than in a world with sanctions, you vote AF. Now let's go into their first contention about increased Russian aggression. Several responses. One, it's completely non-unique. According to the Center for European Reform, Russia views the West as an existential threat, so it will always act aggressively against the West. Look to the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine before sanctions were in place, and it occupied Crimea before sanctions were in place. My opponents confuse cause and effect. Russian aggression caused sanctions, not the other way around. Thus, the AF world is always better than the neg world. Since Russia will be aggressive no matter which side you vote for, it's in our best interest to reduce their capabilities by having sanctions. 2. Sanctions prevent Russia from getting key Western technology necessary for arms production by limiting their access to Western companies, according to the weak, reducing their military capabilities. 3. Look to their Nathan card about 50,000 troops and turn it against them. The card itself says that these 50,000 troops are actually stuck in Russia on the border, doing nothing. These 50,000 troops aren't in Ukraine. Extend the EU Institute for Security Studies card from our second contention, which says that these 50,000 troops would have invaded Ukraine and conquered all of eastern Ukraine in a world without sanctions. So the fact that they're just sitting around on the Russian border proves that sanctions are working. In a world without sanctions, these troops will be invading Ukraine and escalating the conflict. 4th, in response to their study about 195% increase in conflict, extend the Colgan study, which says that sanctions will reduce Russia's military aggression by 250% by reducing oil production, and prefer Colgan over my opponent's study because Colgan is specific to Russia. Theirs is a meta-analysis of hundreds of different countries which don't actually apply to the specific targeted sanctions leveraged against Russia's unique economy. Next, on to counter-sanctions and Europe being hurt. 1. Turn. The point of sanctions is to isolate Russia from the global economy. By adding counter-sanctions, Russia further isolates itself from the world economy and just plays into the West's hands. 2. There's no impact to this. According to the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Russian exports to the European Union constitute 13% of Russia's GDP, whereas European exports to Russia represent less than 1% of European GDP. So on balance, as this topic asks, sanctions are good because they disproportionately affect Russia. 3. According to the Swedish Defense Agency, because Russia uses counter-sanctions often as a retaliatory tool, Western companies already know how to circumvent these restrictions. And 4. There's no link. According to the Swedish Defense Agency, Western companies are just shifting trade from Russia to other countries. There's no impact. 21 of 28 European countries have actually increased exports since sanctions came into effect. So on balance, sanctions haven't had a big impact. 5. Turn this against them because counter-sanctions are good in the long term because they incentivize Western companies to shift their focus to more reliable trade partners. And also look back to our framework, which they conceded in their last speech, that lives outweigh economics. So even if 76 or 80% of Danish dairy farmers go out of business, that's much preferable to a situation in which Russia causes full-scale war with either the West or Ukraine. Next, on to the Middle East. 1. There are Iran nukes impacts. 6 responses. 1. It is in both the Russia and the U.S.'s interest to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. It doesn't benefit Russia geostrategically to give Iran an unstable actor nuclear weapons. They never tell you why Russia benefits by doing that. 2. There's no link. U.S. and Russian diplomats have openly agreed to ignore sanctions to focus on negotiating with Iran to prevent proliferation. So the diplomats of Russia even admit that sanctions haven't affected their impact calculus. In fact, the New York Times reports that last week a Russian ship left Iran carrying over 25,000 pounds of nuclear material. Now turn their entire contention. Sanctions on Iran are what forced Iran to negotiate with the West and agree to the Iran deal. That shows that sanctions are good at coercing other countries into agreeing with the West. And 5th, there's no impact. Sanctions, basically they say Russia sends air missiles to Iran, but that doesn't affect us because those are defensive weapons. Only if we invade Iran will those weapons actually have an effect, and we won't need to because Russia is removing nuclear material from Iran. Lastly, on to Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Turn this against them. If Russia is giving money and arms to our allies, Egypt and Saudi Arabia are U.S. allies, that benefits us, and they don't give you any negative impact to Russia funding our allies and giving them weapons. And they don't give you an impact as why that would be against Western interests, or if they would turn against the West. For these reasons, I urge an ballot.
Alright, we'll start prep time. Alright, stop. I got 45 here.
Yep.
Alright, are all of my judges ready? Opponents? Joyce? Actions speak louder than words, and because sanctions are increasing the capability and the ground attacks actually happening right now, we urge you to negate. With that in mind, start on the framework. First, they talk about this two worlds framework. The resolution asked us never to compare two different worlds. They're just making this assumption. All we have to prove to you is that they're increasing the threat or the threat has stayed the same. They just make this assertion that we have to defend two worlds. Secondly, we agree that lives are very important, but specifically, we need to look to the Ukrainian lives first because sanctions were imposed specifically to counter the situation in Ukraine. That's the most pertinent issue here. With that in mind, go to their case. Their first contention talks about oil development, specifically in the Arctic. We have a lot of responses here. First, Sino-Russian cooperation enables Russia to continue its Arctic development. Tim Riley of the Oil and Gas Journal explains that Western sanctions have caused U.S. companies to pull out of the Arctic, causing China to fill the void and increasing Sino-Russian cooperation. As a result, Russia's Minister of Energy himself has declared that Russian government will resume drilling in the Arctic with no delay. Prefer this piece of evidence because it's from the Russian Minister of Energy himself, and their evidence is just from random Western journalists. Secondly, Richard Conley delinks this argument when he explains that sanctions have empirically had no effect on Russia's oil production, so there's no reduction in the threat. They don't get access to their 250% aggression card. But thirdly, you can turn this argument again, because even if you buy that sanctions halt Russia's Arctic development, this is actually a bad thing since Russia is critical to the Arctic in several areas. Riley explains that Russia's science, technology, and infrastructure benefit the Arctic in areas such as climate research and regional cooperation. And fourthly, according to Reuters, because of sanctions, Russia is actually cooperating more with Iran now to drill in the Persian Gulf, and that's only going to exacerbate their impacts. And their impact off of this oil argument is a reduction in aggression. Remember that we have to look to Ukraine first. Two key pieces of evidence. First, according to Nick Bruce of the New York Times, Ukrainian civilian deaths have doubled after sanctions. There's a clear impact to the terminal impact of this argument, whereas we're showing you Russia's getting more aggressive and killing twice as many people. Secondly, we're showing you that 50,000 troops are being deployed into the border. They misread our evidence. The title is literally saying that they're sending 50,000 troops into Ukraine. With that in mind, go to the second contention about the Baltic invasion. The main problem with this argument is it's completely infeasible. According to Pravda, it's, quote, it's all fantasy. Russia has a powerful nuclear deterrent, and NATO will never attack a nuclear Russia. And Russia will never launch any military action against NATO. Essentially, the concept of mutually assured destruction ensures that they'll never go to war. They say that they have an interest in going into the Baltics, but Putin is inherently a rational actor, according to Washington Post. He's never going to want to inflict a nuclear war. This is completely improbable because that devastates his own country. That's just not probable, and that doesn't factor into his decision calculus. But secondly, you can turn this argument, because even if you believe that there is a possibility of this conflict, we turn this because we show you that sanctions increase the probability of conflict by 195%. That's from our first contention. So if anything, you don't grant them or their impact, or you turn the argument against them. With that in mind, go to Rebuild on our case. On our first contention, they tell you that this is non-unique because they were already invading before sanctions. We tell you that sanctions are making Putin retaliate and uniquely increasing aggression. We show you specifically after sanctions, according to Bruce, a double in killings, and he sent 50,000 troops to the border. The second key argument here is military Keynesianism. Because Russia's economy is declining right now because of sanctions, he's increasing his budget towards military spending. In fact, this has increased by 33%, and he's built 40 new nuclear warheads. Overall, on all fronts, aggression is increasing. Next, they tell you that they don't have the technology to do so in an aft world. But understand that we saw back the terminal impact of a double in killings. If their link card was true, there would be a reduction in killings. That's clearly not happening. On our second contention, they say that Russia doesn't want to give Iran nukes. We're not talking about directly giving them nuclear weapons. They're giving them the S-300 defense system, which completely undermines the Iranian deal because it doesn't allow the U.S. to enforce the counterstrikes against nuclear proliferation. For these reasons, we urge you to negate.
Can I ask first question?
Yeah.
Okay. How do we determine if sanctions are effective?
How sanctions are effective?
How do we determine if sanctions are effective?
I would argue that we should look to Ukrainian aggression first. Can I have a question now?
Okay, but how do we measure that?
We give you a bunch of ways to measure that.
No,
First,
how do we measure
there's been
how
a doubling in
sanctions are
civilian
effective? No,
killings.
I'm not even asking. I'm just saying, how do we even measure whether sanctions are effective or not?
I'm telling you.
How do we even tell that?
Through analyzing how many lives are being lost, for example, on the Ukrainian front.
Okay,
Wait,
but you say you talk about lives, but we're talking about whether sanctions are effective. So you talk about lives.
Yeah, and I
in
tell you
terms.
the main way to
Okay,
analyze
so how
that
do
is
you
by looking at
how do you
Ukrainian
isolate those lives lost and directly link those to sanctions?
Right,
What tells you that because of sanctions
we-
these lives are being lost?
We give you two warrants. First of all is the Keynesianism argument. Since Russia's economy.
No, it's not even about that. I'm just saying
No,
how do
I'm trying
you
to answer your
isolate
question.
sanctions?
Are you just going to answer your own question?
Well, because you're not answering my question. I'm not even talking about the
Right,
case
so-
itself. I'm just saying
okay,
on
so
a
you guys are
metaphysical
trying
level,
to-
how do you evaluate whether sanctions are effective or
a
not?
couple of things here. First, the app has the burden of proof in today's round. So you guys have to prove our clear reduction in Ukrainian aggression. If we show you contrary, that completely
Okay, so
deletes
how do we
aggression
determine
argument.
if there was a reduction in Ukrainian aggression?
By all the evidence that I read you in my book. Can I have a question now?
How do we determine? Not
Through
what's
the
the
lives
answer?
lost, I tell you there is doubling in civilian
I
killings.
know,
Can
but how do we
Alright,
say
can I
whether
have
that's
a
due to
question
sanctions
now?
or not?
We
Okay,
spent a
basically
lot
what I'm
of
trying
time
to
on
say
this.
is that in order to see if sanctions are effective, you have to isolate whether
Okay,
sanctions
so you can
themselves,
bring this up.
like
Can
any
I-
scientific experiment.
Alright,
And so the best way to determine
Can I
whether
get to
sanctions
my
are effective or
question
not is
Your
to
brother
isolate
can bring
them
this
between
up
a
in
world
his
with and a world without sanctions.
Joyce will tell you how to analyze it through lives. Can
That's
I have
okay,
a
that's
question
fine,
now?
yeah.
So let's talk about this Baltic invasion argument, right?
Yeah.
Why would Putin want nuclear war inflicted upon all of Russia?
He doesn't.
Right. So like, why would he invade the? Like,
yeah, so this is the key
why would
link
he
here. This
invade
is
the
the key
Baltics in a
impact.
world without
When
sanctions?
Putin invades the Baltics, he puts NATO in a double bind. Either NATO responds, and let me just finish. Either NATO
Alright.
responds and escalates into war with Russia, which obviously no one wants,
So that doesn't make sense to me.
or NATO doesn't
So-
respond because of mutually assured destruction, and NATO loses credibility for not
Can I
enforcing
cut you
Article
off
5.
right there?
This is
So-
comparatively worse according to the rule
the
card
first-
we read, which
alright,
showed you that
can you
Russian
please let
aggression
me
would
speak?
increase in the event
So,
of NATO collapse.
I just want to. So the very first words you said to my question is when Putin attacks. I'm questioning why Putin would attack in a world without sanctions, since like we agree like he doesn't want nuclear like war inflicted upon his state. Like in like this world's framework that you talk about, like that you say that we should defend, right? In a world without sanctions, why would he invade the Baltics if that's going to like involve nuclear war?
Well, first, that's the EU Institute card we clearly extended you dropped, which says that in
Wait,
a
no.
world without sanctions, Putin would have continued expanding
No,
in eastern Ukraine
like
and
not like
hybrid
just
warfare
like
would have been successful.
don't
Then the
hide
military
behind your
times
evidence
card.
here. Can you explain to me logically why Putin would want nuclear destruction on Russia?
Okay, this is why he would invade the Baltics. Putin is successful using hybrid warfare in Ukraine. West doesn't respond, not militarily, not with sanctions. Putin sees he's successful. He looks upward. He sees the Baltics. They're another country that's geostrategically important to
that's
Russia. Putin uses the same tactics that work in Ukraine, hybrid warfare, to invade and successfully take over the Baltics. That's the Link story.
Okay, we'll take that.
Yeah,
You guys should be cross-setting each other, because like, I don't think any of us are.
Oh yeah, we are.
Yeah.
Are you gonna
Stop that. So it's 120.
120 used.
Yeah, so that's we're out of time. Alright, no, just kidding. We have 25 seconds left.
Alright, 25 left.
Okay, so, you guys are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna really quickly do framework and then give figures. Okay, everyone good? We have to look to two different worlds. The reason why is we cannot isolate sanctions unless we look to a world with sanctions and a world without. There's no way that we can actually look to what sanctions cost unless we can see a world with and a world without. That's just like you can't do without that. So now let's look in a world with and a world without. We must use lives holistically on a global scale because we're not just talking about Ukrainian interests, we're talking about Western interests. That's what the topic asks us. Therefore, the whole entire thing about impacting Ukrainian lives doesn't matter. We're looking at what impacts Western interests. So now let me tell you the first voter. The first voter is going to be the dropped Kogan study and the dropped Wall Street Journal card. These both specifically tell you that if we allow Russia to expand in the Arctic, this increases Russian aggression. They never respond to this in the last speech, extended throughout the route. The Kogan card is going to be important because it tells you holistically Russia's aggression will increase 250% if we don't stop them in the Arctic. That's the first card. Wall Street Journal tells you that if we cannot prevent Russian expansion in the Arctic, it escalates the conflict into geopolitical competition over those resources. That's what links to the US-Russia war. In addition, their only response to this is that other countries can lend them technology. However, they completely misunderstand the links. We tell you not just technology, operational expertise too. We also tell you they need the funds. There's a lot more warrants than they actually respond to. In addition, their only main offense that they have left about aggression, which is kind of the biggest issue in the round, is one that is increased likelihood of conflict by 195%. Cross-apply our Kogan study because this is actually specific to Russia. It's not just a world study. Secondly, the 50,000 troops increase. They never respond to our argument that these troops are in Russia right now. Without sanctions, turn this against them. They never respond to it. Without sanctions, these troops would be invading Ukraine. That's also going to be a really critical point. It's going to be the dropped EU Institute card they never respond to. This empirically tells us that on balance, Russian troops have been deterred from invading farther into Ukraine. That's the most important voter because right there you see we have deterred Russian aggression in both the short and long term. In addition, their last piece of office is about how casualties have increased. However, you have to still look to a world with and a world without. If Russia continued to invade into Ukraine, we can obviously assume that casualties would increase way more than in the status quo because sanctions have prevented Russia from increasing their expansion into Ukraine. That's the EU Institute card they dropped. For that reason, you should affirm.
Alright, I got 31 from last time, so we'll continue that. Alright, I got 1 minute. So 131 total, 29.
Is everybody ready? The only offense my opponents have left on their side of the flow is Baltic states and oil development. But you're not looking to these arguments for a few reasons. First, let's look to oil development. First of all, remember we tell you that the Prime Minister of Energy of Russia tells you that there's going to be no delay in oil drilling. That outweighs all of their evidence because it tells you that Russia is not going to stop getting oil. But second of all, even if you don't buy that, remember we tell you that Russia is going to cooperate with Iran in order to drill in the Persian Gulf. Insofar as they have another source of oil, they're not going to get access to their 250% impact. But next, look to their Baltic invasion. They never respond to the fact that Russia is simply not going to take over the Baltic states because of mutually assured destruction. Keeping that in mind, let's look to how you're evaluating today's round. Remember why you're not looking to worlds with and worlds without. First of all, this asks us to look at a hypothetical alternative world. First of all, that doesn't exist, that's hard to weigh. And second of all, that's not what the resolution asks us. You can't put this burden on us. Keeping that in mind, let's move on to the main two reasons why you're voting for us. The first one is going to be off of aggression. They keep on telling you that we're going to limit access to military budget. However, they never respond to the key words of military keenism, which tells you that because Putin feels his economy is threatened, in order to jumpstart his economy, he's going to put more spending from other parts of the economy and allocate it into his budget. Therefore, you're going to be seeing an increase in military spending by 33%. They never respond to this card. But because of that 33%, you're going to be seeing that Putin is currently building 40 more warheads to add to his arsenal. That's a really big impact. But you can see the manifestation of his increased military spending, mainly in Ukraine. First of all, you're seeing that he's adding 50,000 troops. Now, they tell you that these 50,000 troops aren't doing anything, but our card literally says they're in full combat readiness. So insofar as that's going to perpetrate violence in the long term, that's why you're going to be voting for us. But even if you don't want to look to that, you can look to the fact that economic sanctions have actually doubled civilian deaths in Ukraine. That's the biggest lives impact in today's round. You have to weigh that over all else. But then they talk about Odessa. Remember that this is completely hypothetical. They're saying that, oh, if economic sanctions had not been imposed, then they would have Odessa. You can't weigh that argument. But the second reason why you're going to be voting for us is going to be off of the Middle East. Remember, they tell you that it's not in U.S. and Russia's interest, but remember, Putin wants his sphere of influence at all costs. So in order to get that, he's willing to trade nuclear arms with the Middle East. He's willing to give missiles to Iran. For all these reasons, we strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Okay. You guys ready for that?
Yes.
Okay. Can I ask the first question?
Yeah.
Where is Russia drilling in the Persian Gulf right now?
I can't give you coordinates of where in the Persian Gulf.
Or how many barrels of oil? How many barrels of oil?
I can provide evidence. We didn't read that evidence, but
Well, I'd like to see that.
the biggest response here is that
you got your zero.
all right. The biggest response to your Arctic argument is that the Prime Minister of Energy himself of Russia says there is no
So,
delay in Arctic drilling.
Why would the Why would the energy minister of Russia not be at all biased about Russian oil production?
What do you mean?
Like, don't you think he has a vested interest in projecting to the world that Russia is good at drilling oil? Like, that's his literal job.
Right,
Like,
no.
if he admitted that yes, sanctions are effective, then he'd lose his job and he'd probably be in jail right now.
So, alright, so let's talk about this, right?
Like,
so,
why should we trust him over like analysts who've like actually looked at the numbers and
Right, so
told
like,
us that
how
this is
can
not
an
happening?
analyst predict like, oh, they're probably going to be stopped until 2025? That's just like absurd for an analyst to make this
It
assumption,
looks
like
at
this
the production
prediction, right?
levels and tells you
But
that they
secondly,
can't
wait,
get
let's get into the more important meat of this argument, right? Your impact is, Colgan, right? Which is
It's
aggression.
There's two effects.
Wall Street Journal and Colgan, but yeah.
Right, so which is aggression, right? We put a bunch of evidence on the Ukrainian aggression argument. So my next question
Okay,
for
wait,
you is,
so what
can I ask
is-
you a
what is
question
that?
now, since we
I
spent
mean,
a lot of time?
Well,
Can I,
yeah,
so,
that was
can I ask you, where in Ukraine have we seen an empirical manifestation of reduced aggression in Ukraine?
Okay, the dropped EU Institute card, let me tell you, is the most important. We tell
What
you
does
they
that say?
did not invade Novorossiya, but Moldova, Odessa. There's a bunch of different places that
Hold on,
they did
so
not invade directly.
I don't
because of
understand that.
sanctions.
So like, how would someone know that how would someone know that they wouldn't have done this in a world without sanctions?
Okay,
That's
I mean-
very hard to predict.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, well, yes,
That's
obviously
extremely
we can't tell you
hypothetical,
100%, but the fact is, these people working at the EU Institute of Security Studies are analysts who've studied this for like the past 20 years and are like make a living making these predictions. So
Right,
while
these
neither
are-
team can make an accurate prediction like 100%, you should defer
Okay,
to the
so
team
like
that provides
it's-
analysts who study this for a living and
So
say,
like-
yes, this is our best guess
So
what a
instead-
world would have
wait,
looked like
instead
without
of looking
sanctions.
at like a hypothetical situation in which economic sanctions were not imposed, we should look to what's happening in the status
Right,
quo.
and
Because
Well,
of
the
economic
only way to
sanctions-
see if sanctions have reduced the threat is to
And-
see what the threat would have been without sanctions.
Okay, so let's talk about this, right? You guys are saying, you guys are arguing that there's a reduction in the threat. If we read evidence that disproves that there's reduced aggression, that means you default
No,
on faith.
we're
There's
saying,
no
no, the
offense.
topic says sanctions have reduced aggression. It doesn't say, in the time
like
since
the topic
sanctions
is
have been
different.
implemented, Russian aggression has been reduced. No, it says sanctions
Right,
reduce Russian
and
aggression. So
we
what that
also
means,
counter with that
what that means
Putin is
is
stepping
that,
up attacks in the Donbas region as well. We read a bunch of evidence on Ukraine that you never respond to. That
Wait, the
they're
Donbas
increasing their
region?
spending by
The Donbas
33%,
region.
which increases their capability to take 2 times more lives and sending
Okay,
in 50,000
when did
more troops
Putin
into
occupy the Donbas region?
I can't give
It was
you
before sanctions were implemented.
Wait, no,
What
no,
have those
so I can
troops
give you
done
our evidence.
since?
Our evidence is specifically after sanctions, they're increasing their aggression in the Donbas region.
Yeah,
What does
but
that
it's
mean?
already-
Like,
I mean, that
they already
disproves, like,
occupy it. What does
that
that mean?
disproves aggression, which you can bring on the topic.
Alright, we'll take the last 25 seconds. Judge, you ready?
Yes. Yeah.
Punch, ready?
Yeah.
Judge, this round is a science experiment. Our hypothesis as the app is that sanctions have reduced the threat Russia poses to the West. Like any good science experiment, we must isolate sanctions to determine their impacts, to determine if this is the variable that's affecting what we see in the world. They just say this is abusive, but it's clearly the only way to determine whether sanctions have actually reduced the threat. We should look at a policy path in which we either choose sanctions or we don't, and determine what the threat Russia poses to us is in each of these scenarios. That's the only way to evaluate the impacts of sanctions. So now let's say why vote app. Oil. They completely dropped the links and the impacts of this. Sanctions reduce Russia's oil production, extend the Oxford Energy Institute card, so that without Western technology and expertise, Russian oil output will decline 10% every year, which they cold concede. And their lone response is that other countries will help Russia, but the Oxford Energy Card Institute later in the report also specifically tells us that these countries that they're talking about don't have the right technology or even the expertise to operate drilling technology and can't help Russia. My partner makes this response in his previous speech, and the fact that China hasn't helped Russia in the past 3 years, even though sanctions have been occurring, proves that China's not going to help Russia. The impact of this is the Coghlan study, which they clean drop, which says that decreasing Russian oil production will decrease Russian aggression on whole 250%. Insofar as the topic asks whether sanctions reduce the threat Russia poses, you vote app there, clearly. The second impact is the Wall Street Journal card, which they again completely drop, which says that sanctions have physically made it impossible for Russia to drill in the Arctic by preventing them from getting necessary Western technology. So it doesn't even matter if they're drilling in Persian Gulf. This is unique to the Arctic. Because if Russia drills in the Arctic, it will engage in a resource war with the US for over 80 billion barrels of oil in the Arctic. This is huge. And Russia's government has already threatened that it's willing to go to war to protect these Arctic resources if it has the capability to drill. So by limiting Russia's capability to drill, it won't go to war over resources it can't get anyway. That's the link there. And that's the biggest impact of this round because a Russian-US conflict over the Arctic escalates into war which hurts everyone. Now let's talk about their offense. One is Putin spending more on the military, but it doesn't matter how strong the military is if he's not using it. Look to the EU Institute of Security Strategies card, so that in a world without sanctions, Putin would have conquered all of Eastern Ukraine and potentially invaded the Baltic. This is huge because it shows that any impact they show of Russian troops mobilizing behind Russian borders or casualties increasing would have been higher in a world without sanctions because these Russian troops behind Russian borders would have invaded Ukraine and caused even more casualties. Insofar as they completely drop this evidence the entire round, you see that empirically the situation in Ukraine has de-escalated because Russia has stopped conquering new territory.
Alright, we have 29 left. Starting now. Alright, stop. Alright, are all of my judges ready?
Yes.
Opponents? Joyce? Alright. Let's begin by shutting down their offense. Their main piece is oil. A lot of responses that they extend through in here. First is Connolly from Rebuttal, who explains that empirically there's been no change in oil production from Russia after sanctions were imposed. They never respond to this, and they never get any access to this 250% or increase in aggression. Empirically, they're not getting any more or less oil. That completely delinks the argument. Secondly, we tell you that their Sino-Russian cooperation enables to go back into the Arctic without delay, so that empirically delinks the argument once again. And thirdly, they're just substituting the Arctic by going into the Persian Gulf. There's the two other voting issues is first aggression. Their only piece of offense here is like they would have conquered parts of eastern Ukraine in a world without sanctions. This is extremely hypothetical. Prefer our one about military Keynesianism. Because sanctions impose economic harm on Russia, they try to jumpstart their economy by spending more on the military. We corroborate this empirically with a 33% increase in military spending. This is materialized in two ways. First, there's been 2 times the amount of civilians killed in Ukraine. This is a very easy place to vote for us because clearly the conflict is escalating. Secondly, they're sending 50,000 more troops into Ukraine, and once again showing that conflict is escalating. And thirdly, they're building 40 more nuclear warheads, and that's a reason to vote for us because aggression on all fronts is increasing. The third key voting issue is Iran, and they completely dropped this throughout summary and final focus. It's a very easy way to vote for us. Remember that before sanctions, in a world without sanctions, Russia didn't deal the S-300 deal because they wanted to preserve relations with Iran. Because the sanctions uniquely destroyed that relationship, now Russia first, that they don't care about the Western interests, the Western relations. Secondly, they need money from somewhere, so they send S-300s to Iran. That means Iran now has these ballistic missiles, and this deal has already gone through. Because of this, this allows Iran to go unchecked, and their hegemony to expand in the Middle East, enormously. That means we can't enforce our nuclear deal with Iran because we can't counterstrike on them. Because we're winning on Ukrainian aggression and doubling civilian lives lost and 50,000 more troops, and we block out oil, and because we're showing you that there's a unique threat in more S-300s to Iran, we urge you to negate the resolution. Thank you.
I would like to see the 250% and the 195%, please.
Colgate, and then your...
Y'all can just chill, by the way.
Yeah,
this
it's gonna
might
be a
take
while.
little bit.
Your EU security and cooperation cards on Russia just invading the shit out of the Baltics. Can I see your Iran S-300? Yeah, that too.
So, okay, yeah, so,
This final round, we're gonna
yeah.
see probably almost everything.
Yeah.
Also, the note, I'm gonna write these down.
yeah.
Here, let's just all write it down on one piece of paper. That way.
Yeah, okay. I'm in pink.
Okay. I'll be in orange. Wait, no, orange you can't see. I'll be white. No, we're just writing it on. I'm red.
Oh, my ink's black.
Is it okay if I just like pull up evidence for one judge?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, you need to do
No,
all 3
you
ones.
all at
We
the
each get
same
a
time.
third of the screen.
You have to pay for the split view app, and we want to see all these cards at the same time. Yeah. You drop the round.
Whoever can fit more cards on their screen wins.
Well, so 250 was
Colgan.
yeah.
So just Colgan Museum Institute.
I also wrote in highlighter, so.
Were there other cards you wanted to see, or just the?
Yeah, we're writing them all down on our paper.
Oh, we should have given like one to each team. From you guys, I just need the 250. If we want
Can I
like,
see the dairy stuff? That like
The-
the Western countries can, like Western companies can like basically respond to lack of Russian imports of EU dairies.
Wait, so like the.
not to jack you, Xavier, but I'm easy. I just want one card, just for
Okay,
250. Let's start with that, and then we can just slowly move through these.
Wait, sorry, just to make sure I have the right response. You want the one that's Western countries
The Western
are used to counter
companies.
sanctions and they're diverting, or
Yes.
the one that says on balance exposure?
Here you go.
Alright, is that the full list?
This is
That is
Alright.
just for me. It's just for me.
Alright, yeah. Alright. Yeah, I'll start with you.
this 250. Cool.
Yeah.
The Swedish defense.
From you guys,
Yeah.
the paper cups.
These are the counter sanctions.
Are you waiting for ballots? Oh, okay. You're just hanging. Okay.
You guys made the claim.
We're doing a lot of evidence.
Any more cards on you? Okay.
Yeah, so like selling us going to Iran.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
This one's good. Who are the Warriors playing? Yeah,
Both-
you should like.
Both computers should have every card,
Yeah.
by the way. Like, pro tip: make your first speaker give their laptop away. Is how I got through debate.
Oh, one thing I like told kids in Texas is like if you use paper, just double print everything. That way you can just give it and then it doesn't matter.
I was like the worst partner. I was literally like, I'm a second grader. I need my computer more. Basically.
Here is freaking gold. So those are all. Oh, shoot. Cool. Alright, and this is the last one, Persian gold.
What?
Can I see the 150? 195?
The whole order, sorry.
Okay, so you have this one.
Yeah, if you want to read it, but the title's easy.
Okay. Here's y'all. Okay. So 195.
Yeah, she has.
Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
Can I see the
Production
Persian Gulf,
changes.
Yeah.
Persian Gulf.
Persian Gulf is on here for both.
Like,
Yeah.
in the middle.
Okay, yeah, I have all that.
Yeah, I mean the place was suited.
Okay.
I really like when people highlight like the
Yeah.
headline. It's one of my favorite things to do. People are like, where's the quote? And I'm like, it's there.
Anything else?
Yeah.
Alright, I'll just leave
You
you.
wrote no change. What was the no change in production?
Oh, no change in oil
Oh,
production.
Conley, yep. I got that. Alright. Just the middle card.
Awesome.
Oh, and the 500,000 troops.
Oh yeah, Joyce 500.
Okay.
That's the no change in oil.
Yeah. Where?
It's the middle card.
Middle. Okay. RT. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's Conley.
Yeah.
Okay.
I assume no one cares if there's like not like comments written on the online.
that's
Okay.
fine.
I'm gonna talk you there,
I'm
Robin.
not ready.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
Alright.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah.
Anything else from Harker?
I got none.
Alright.
Thank you.
You want-
Text mom, will you get me a takeout order with 2 avocado rolls from the sushi place at Tatum and Shay, please? Question mark. I love you.
I changed Siri to
I use Siri just like honestly. Let's submit our ballots.
You submitted your ballot
Yeah,
already?
I have. I mean, I just waited what I could wait before I had those cards, and then I had like this much to do.
Yeah.
It's also just a coin.
That's a good way to do it. Yeah, there's like nothing on your ballot. It's all gonna be good.
That's all.
Oh, you get to disclose. Okay. Once you submit it.
Oh boy.
All the pressure's on.
Are you guys excited?
Yeah.
This is like the most petty power trip I've ever been on.
Yes.
I like the one kid who laughed.
You for having power trips.
Your power trips are just you being a jerk. Sometimes he gives like ridiculous.
I would give really like hardcore like critiques and then just not tell. And then, you can look online later.
You are a final basketball girl, so you got protested because the judges disclosed before the third one signed their ballot. It was like
I've already
super stressful.
been accused for collusion twice.
That's because you talked to the other judges.
No,
You can't show me BuzzFeed articles from other judges.
no, it was
Like-
collusion as in
Like I know it's BuzzFeed, but it looks sketchy.
no, it was collusion. So it was like it was because one of which was because I rewrote my whole ballot. The other time, and then Brittany got really mad at me because it was against Alex Field. Because I like just hate her teams now. And the other time was against Horizon.
You guys wanna know who won?
Yes.
Alright, I'll disclose. It is a 2-to-1 ballot for the con. Cool. So, typically we have since there's one pro, we have that
A couple of random points. Overall, the debate was super good, super polite. I do, however, in large print, have the word shit show written in reference to Second Crossfire, in which nothing happened. I don't know, nothing of substance was said, it just kind of made me angry. I voted for the pro because, mostly on oil, that, the card that you show about the 250% doesn't really, you make it out to seem like it says losing oil is going to make Russia less aggressive, but what the card actually says is just that petrostates are more likely to be aggressive, and even if Russia can't access their Arctic drilling, they're still totally a petrostate, so I don't buy that card. But I do buy the idea that if we can keep Russia out of the Arctic, we're going to have less conflict in the Arctic, because there's a lot of territorial disputes between Russia and Alaska and the United States. I buy that. I think that we're reducing Russia's threat to take oil that we otherwise would drill and take. So I think that's a fine argument. I buy your framework about weighing global lives, because we're talking about Western interests. Although you guys had a really interesting warrant for looking at Ukrainian lives specifically. I also buy the argument about the 50,000 troops otherwise would have invaded, and then Odessa and Moldova. There was this weird moment where you guys were arguing about Novorossiya and Donbass, and those are the same region. The Donbass region of Ukraine declared independence and became Novorossiya. Should clarify that. Basically, what it came down to is that on the neg, I saw military spending is increasing, but on the con, I was saying he's not Putin isn't invading where he otherwise would be. And you say oh, we can't weigh hypotheticals, but to me that's how we weigh things, right? If I have a friend who's has no idea what's going on for a test, he hasn't showed up to class for the entire section of the test, and I'm yo, dude, I need, I'm gonna make you study, and I pull him in and tutor him and teach him the whole material, and then he passes. It's clear that he passed when he otherwise would not have, and you can't say oh, well, that's a hypothetical. You don't know how he would have done if he just hadn't studied, because when you use sort of logic, you can analyze things that would have happened, and we don't know for 100% certainty. But when Putin is saying I'm gonna invade the Donbass region, and then we're no sanctions, and he goes okay, I won't. That to me seems a pretty clear cause and effect, even if you can't know it for certain, but that's how we analyze why things happened. So basically, I bought their arguments about preventing invasions and about preventing oil conflicts, and that's why I voted for the F.
So I went neg. So literally the only two things that were really left on the flow was between oil and retaliation. And so I totally bought Keynesian military spending. And so you guys talk about how, so first of all, you throw this block as basically, the Russian aggressions, caused the sanctions, but that doesn't really mean that retaliation itself doesn't stand as an argument. But even then, when you're talking about, so you try and turn it saying the troops are just stuck at the border, but even at that point where they were sent to the border, they still pose threat to Western interests. Regardless of whether they're just stuck there or not, even if they are just stuck there, if Putin's oh, you know what, fuck it, let's go invade, they're right there. They pose perhaps the most imminent threat to Ukraine and Western interests, regardless of if they're dithering there or they return. The fact that their proximity is so close to Russia, is so close to Ukraine, presets an imminent threat by Russian troops. And so I don't really buy that term. And then, so, at that point where we're seeing, Putin still, going balls to the walls with his spending, there seems to be an argument just, pushing through, saying, Russia, even with these sanctions, is still posing a large threat to Western interests, i.e., the only, real, human life weighing that ever actually happened in this round was Ukraine. And so it's Russia is still posing a large-ass threat to Ukraine. And so they get a lot of offense off of that. And then on the oil point, so you talk about Wall Street Journal, how they no longer have exploration abilities for the Arctic, but at the point where they're saying, well, Russia is still producing the same amount of oil as they were previously. The oil ministry itself is saying we are still going to do these new explorations. There seems to be some tinge towards the side that, like, even if Russia's low on cash, they're still going to do these things. And so in their economy card, they literally say, like, Russia's building, like, these oil rigs to, like, do new explorations for oil. So at that point, like, oil revenues are still coming in for Russia, and, like, I sort of don't really buy, like, Sino-Russian cooperation as, like, a real threat, but when you're talking about, like, so, like, when you're talking about your Colgan card, and it's like, as you said, like, this 250%, like, it wasn't really, like, the way the card reads is just saying petrostates are just innately more aggressive, and so I feel like that sort of predates any, like, form of sanctions. So, like, Russia still has access to this oil. So, pre or post sanctions, Russia is still a highly aggressive state, and when they're saying, like, Russia's, like, killed, like, double the number of Ukrainians as previously, they're literally just showing me even more that, like, your Colgan card is, like, just in the theory of, like, petrostates as a whole. But when they're saying, like, Russia is still, like, killing people, like, left and right, it just gives me more reason to, like, believe the idea that Russia overall has not been hindered in its vicious and aggressive acts against, like, Western interests in places like Ukraine.
Can I jump in? There's more I forgot to say.
Oh my god.
I just like to hear myself talk. I just feel like I should do like your case of service. So like the reason I just wanted to talk about really quickly Iran and the Persian Gulf. But like when I looked at I liked the argument that you made about Russia drilling in the Persian Gulf. But when I looked at the evidence, it said that like Russia will build oil rigs for Iran, not that like Russia itself is going to be drilling and getting oil, and that's a very different statement. So yeah, when you talk about like there's no change in Russian oil production, that to me means like inside of Russia, which is different from what they're talking about in the Arctic, and like also different from what's happening in like Persia, and I think that got very muddled. And then the idea of sending missiles to Iran, like I buy their argument that they're like it doesn't matter because they're defensive missiles, and you say like oh well now we can't like counterstrike. We could never strike their nuclear facilities. Like if you try to bomb Isfahan, you're going to make all of Iran uninhabitable because it'll be a nuclear wasteland. Like you cannot attack a nuclear plant.
It's also a mountain.
Yeah.
All of them are mountains.
Oh yeah, just like that would be just a bad idea. So like I don't buy that hinders our ability to like send in the IAEA because like we use sanctions with Iran to just destroy them. I mean it took like 7 years, but like to me like Iran having some missiles to defend their ridiculous mountain fortress that will turn the world into a nuclear wasteland if it blows up like didn't make a difference to me. Okay, I'm done now for real.
Cool. Usually I'm the one who talks a lot, but I don't know if they said most of it, but I'll start off with, there's a few things. One thing I did like on the Pro, I did buy the Arctic one. The fact that because of the sanctions, that Russia can't go to the Arctic, they lack the technology, they lack the expertise, so they're not going to be able to drill the oil, so it's deterring their economy, it's making them be good, you know, all that. But with that being said, though, I really think that the Khan did a really good job talking about the 50,000 troops being sent to Ukraine. Actually, on the article, I googled it too this morning. It's actually more than 50,000 troops to my surprise. But the 50,000 troops, like he said, it's like having a gun pointed at your face. Like that is definitely a threat, even though they're still within Russia or annexed Crimea. That is definitely a huge threat, and so it can be taken that way. And also, they talk about how there's an increase in military spending. And while the Pro talks about that it's not really a guarantee of anything, I think the two together is what makes it solid. If it was one or the other, it maybe wouldn't have weighed so much. But we have 50,000 troops and we're increasing the spending dramatically. I think it's logical to say that they're probably, you know, a dangerous threat. Also, I like, in the beginning on the Con, I really wish you guys blew this one up more. But you did. I really wish you guys mentioned the whole damage that these sanctions were doing to the European Union, because I've doing this all day. I've been hearing all sorts of different facts, but 86% of farmers facing bankruptcy. That's pretty heavy. I've been hearing arguments like 1% of the GDP went down. Like, what do you do? Who cares about that? But 86% of farmers are important, and that's a big deal. That's food. You know, we need food. But where I think where you guys really sold me though. I was actually weighing towards the Pro until the very end. the last 10 seconds of that rebuttal was great, because when you mentioned how Russia sold the S-300 AA gun, anti-air missile system, to Iran, and now Iran is like armed and has these nukes and no one's going to stop them, and this never would have happened if it were for the sanctions, that right there outweighed your guys' World War III nuke scenario, because yours is hypothetical, which is fine because we're in the realm of fiat, but this actually happened, and with the pro side, we could have World War III, we could have all these nukes go off, but on their side, Iran's already getting the nukes and they're already able to defend it, so I see that this is more likely to happen sooner, and we can get the same outcome with that because of the tensions. You know, we can get World War III right out of there as well. So that, I think it was really, really good. Also, I just a little bit of criticism. Go easy on the cross-sex. I know it's really hard to find the right amount of aggression, but it was a little much at first. I was kind of just wow, watching it. But that being said, also good job later in the cross-sex. I see you kind of came back up. You're like, I'm not taking nothing, and you got your questions across. But your guys' structure is both really good, but I do feel like there were some dropped arguments in the very beginning of the debate, and you guys both dropped quite a few arguments, but overall it's really good, and to avoid a World War III, it seemed a little bit more realistic than the one you had, because there's already, part of it's already taking place, where the other one's really hypothetical. I went with the Iran one, because I totally see Iran possibly going into World War III more than Russia would. So, outstanding job, guys. You all did very, very well.
Thank you.
Alright, wait, you have awards!
We all have one
Don't leave without those.